My guest is Andrés Martinez. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The Great Game, A Tale of Two Footballs and America's Quest to Conquer Global Sport. It's in bookstores everywhere on April 2nd. He's a former New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and LA Times editor, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, and he's a professor at Arizona State University's Cronkite School of Journalism. Andrés, thanks for joining me on Sports Business Radio. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Fascinated by your book. Obviously, there's long been this debate about American football and European soccer, but let's start with, why did you write the book? What led you to write the book?
Well, I've always been fascinated by how important sport is and how people connect to each other and to their geographies. I think it's something I came to appreciate as a teenager. I grew up in a very American household in Mexico. My mother was a gringa from Dallas, Texas, who went down to Mexico City to teach the American school. Thought it'd be a fun thing, adventure to do for a year or two, getting out of college. Met my Mexican dad. And so the 1 or 2 year plan turned into a 30-year plan. And so I had this experience growing up. And again, we spoke English at home. I looked like a gringo. I didn't think of the United States as a foreign country. We spent plenty of time visiting relatives in Texas. But when I first moved here at the age of 15, now I'm not that young, so this is in the 1980s, boy, oh boy, the one way in which I felt like I had been dropped on a different planet or behind some sporting iron curtain was when it came to sport. And it really struck me how the paradox of the United States being, in many ways, sometimes we overthink this or exaggerate this, but it is true that when it comes to lots of pop culture, the U.S. is the center of the universe, and yet that was not true when it came to sport. So there was a global sporting culture that you're part of, whether you grew up in Mexico or Germany or Nigeria. And I come to the United States, and we have this culture where we play our own games, and sport had historically been the way in which we expressed our exceptionalism, our isolationism, call it what you will. We have a World Series in this domestic sport. One of the things I remind my students is, our most popular athletes in our most followed sports league never get to represent the U.S. Tom Brady never got to wear a Team USA jersey. We're seeing how that's changing in baseball and some of our other sports and how exciting that is. But anyways, long fascination with this subject, which now I have sort of leaned into as a journalistic and academic pursuit. And I think a lot of this is really changing now. And that's why I felt like now was the time to write this book about how Americans are starting to connect to the rest of the world through sport in a way that historically we did not.
Yeah, let's talk about the two footballs for a minute. So you've got the NFL that is king in the United States, by far the most popular, lucrative league in the United States. And then you've got soccer. And I'm really fascinated. We've got World Cup coming to North America this year. There's been a big gap between the two leagues like NFL and Major League Soccer and even NWSL. Do you think World Cup is going to close the gap and increase the interest in soccer in the United States?
I think it's another step on this journey that the U.S. has been on since I first came to the U.S. I can remember going to matches during the '94 World Cup that the U.S. hosted on the Men's World Cup. And that was a step, and that led to the creation of the MLS. So yes, I think it should help. There's a fun debate to be had as to whether in order for it to be a significant step forward, the U.S. men's national team needs to do well. That's an interesting,
Agreed.
Fun debate. Because on the one hand, one of the novelties, if you are an American fan of soccer, is on the men's side, at least, you get to play the role of an underdog, right? Like that's kind of a fun, different experience. But I do think that, we're seeing a convergence of the two footballs. You talk about there's a huge gap between the NFL and anything, right? Major League Baseball, NBA, certainly MLS. And I think the MLS has an interesting story in how far they've come. But it's also true that it's not the totality of American soccer. Because one of the things that, as an investment story is almost more interesting or equally interesting is the sort of American invasion of European football. So you have a lot of sports operators. I happen to be a big Arsenal fan in the
Okay.
English league, and my team is now shares owners with the LA Rams. And if when they play their crosstown rivals in Chelsea, it's they share the same ownership group as the Dodgers, right? So you have a lot of operators of our American football now investing in the global game. Those same owners are hosting this World Cup. They're eager to have those World Cup games in their stadium. And some American sports investors are growing the MLS, but plenty of them are also investing or choose instead to invest in European soccer. And you can also not judge how far soccer has come just by looking at MLS ratings, for example. Because of this globalization, I can watch Arsenal on NBC, and that's cutting into the MLS's audience and potential growth. Now, they say, what's good for the sport is good for all of us, but it's a double-edged sword in the sense that globalization and the rise of soccer within the US obviously has helped the MLS, but because you can watch any league on earth sitting here in the US, it's kind of a little bit like if you were in Germany, would you watch your domestic basketball league or the NBA if you could, right? Like that would be the flip side of that.
Yeah. The other thing is, so I've had Emma Hayes, the U.S. women's national team coach, on this show, and other people from around Major League Soccer. I think Ted Lasso is a thing, right? People have paid more attention to soccer, whether it's European soccer or just soccer in general, because of watching Ted Lasso. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's. I'm glad you bring up Ted Lasso because I'm fascinated by Ted Lasso on many levels beyond just appreciating it as a
Sure.
show. I think like it is. Only American media has a fully global reach,
Right.
and only European football has a full total global reach as a sport. So these two entities of U.S. media and European football, they were kind of bound to hook up at some point, right? And so I think it's no accident. Like Hollywood for decades made all these amazing baseball movies. Were they global hits? No. But it just so happens that, movie writers in the US and Hollywood was supposed to produce movies for the world, were obsessed with baseball. How many great soccer movies have there been? I don't think I could get to my second hand in
Right.
counting that. That's going to change probably with this alignment of interest. It's no accident, I feel, that Apple TV's first big global hit happened to be set in the world of the Premier League and English football. Obviously, it's about much more than just soccer, right? In fact, when I
Sure.
was telling my friends, "You've got to watch this show," they were like, "Well, we know you're a soccer nut. We're not going to watch." And like a year later, they'd be. So I think, but I think it has helped sort of but familiarize American audiences with that culture, through the eyes of this American coach that goes over there.
Right.
You see similar dynamic with the whole Wrexham experiment of Ryan
Exactly.
Reynolds and
Yep.
Rob McElhenney acquiring a club over there and making this great show about it. So I think we're seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are learning the basics of promotion and relegation. And, it was so fun how on Ted Lasso, they're teaching him the rules of soccer, basically,
Right.
because he was an American football coach. So people who aren't innately familiar with soccer were kind of learning along the way. I had a chance to go to London 2 years ago and go to many of the places where Ted Lasso was filmed, but also go
Funny.
to Arsenal and Brentford game.
Very
And amazing. And, it's really interesting to see soccer is king in Europe for sure.
Yeah.
And in many parts of the world. So this is why I'm also fascinated by the NFL has made it a priority to play international games. And we could have an international game a week in the next few years. That's how many games they might add to the international slate. So here we've got European soccer and global soccer trying to make inroads in America. And then we've got the NFL trying to expand their footprint internationally and playing games all over the world. It really is an interesting thing to watch.
Yes, it's like the two worlds coming together. And I'm lifelong fan of both footballs. But I don't mean when I say that the Americans are now engaging with the rest of the world through sport in a way that they hadn't, yes, that's largely a story about the rise of soccer in the US and of the US in the world of soccer, but it's also a story about our homegrown sports having quite a bit of success in growing overseas. And this year we saw NBA All-Star had, the game had a they had a in the mini series they had a world team that just
Hmm.
which on paper was probably the best, right? Like that shows you. And how many MVPs in a row has the NBA had from international players? That shows you the success in growing the sport globally. One of my chapters in the book, I go down to Brazil with Green Bay fans, and it's to your point about the international games. First game of a regular season, Green Bay Packers playing in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Like, what is happening? And there's a craze, right? So it's like the two, and they're playing in the stadium that was built for the Brazil 2014 World Cup. And yet, you can flip the other side of the coin is, Manchester City and Bayern Munich have played a game at a sold out Lambeau field. Like what,
Hmm.
again, what is happening? So it's definitely a two-way street. The NFL, I think it's been years now since Paul Tagliabue, I mean, what's that? Previous commissioner sat down with his owners and said, we can be a league with 400 million followers or a league with 4 billion followers. And there's been this push, right, of trying to get the NFL wants to be more like Hollywood. And what I mean by that is a big movie studio, let's say take Avatar, one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. That movie will make roughly three-quarters of its box office overseas, which represents kind of like the relative purchasing power of the US versus the world. Like that is a fully globalized product. The NFL, as successful as it's been within the US, the Super Bowl is still watched by far more people inside the US than outside. So the NFL's growth is clearly overseas. Such a compelling product. I mean, some hardcore sports fans don't like the product, right? But it is, I mean, television product. And so, they look at, whether it's Taylor Swift, who also makes more money outside the US than inside, or a big Hollywood production, they feel like in this popular culture space, they need to be more global. And they also look at the reach of things like the English Premier League and, why not us?
Right. Let's talk about the impact of Messi. Every stadium he plays in, they're setting attendance records, and he fills up big stadiums
We have to
wherever.
move stadiums, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to see. But I also think if we're talking about infiltrating the popularity of European soccer in America, he's also part of this story. You've got one of the greats of all time who's still playing at a high level, who's selling out stadiums all over the country. And then on the heels of that, now we've got World Cup coming in.
Yeah, I mean, the Messi phenomenon is amazing. And it is also tied in with the media piece of it that we were talking about earlier. When he first signed with Inter Miami, apparently he left hundreds of millions on the table in terms of an offer he had to go to Saudi Arabia. And people were like scratching their heads about how an MLS club could afford to compete with that. And I don't know that anything was ever really matched, but they were able to cobble together a very compelling offer. Plus, maybe he wanted other reasons to live in Miami. But the bulk of his contract is tied to Apple's MLS deal.
Right.
So again, this is media thinking, we have a streaming service, we want it to be global. How can we achieve this goal? And it's almost like a Hollywood studio when you are going to produce a movie, you figure who's going to be your star, your talent, and you go to Tom Cruise or whomever. I'm dating myself, maybe Timothée Chalamet, and you offer them points, right? And so it was like a similar thing with Messi. And suddenly, people around the world are like, "Wait, the U.S. has a domestic league? Like, wait, where do I get this?" Because Apple, shortly before that, had come to the MLS and said, "We want global rights." And everybody's like, why would they want global rights? It's not like there are that many people banging down the door to, televise the MLS in other parts of the world. But they were, I guess, thinking a little bit ahead of everyone else because they were like, they want those global rights, and then they go pursue Messi. So it has really helped. I mean, I remember when Beckham came to LA, previous generations, we had in the 1970s, the NASL bringing Pele. All of this helps. It's also true that, one player or a couple of stars aren't going to completely, change the course of or the fate of a league or a sport, but it's accompanied by so many other things that are going on, and the timing. And I think the timing may not be that coincidental, and that maybe he wanted to be here leading up to, I think, what he sees perhaps as his final World Cup. It's amazing to me how important international competition is for these mega millionaire athletes. When you watch a World Cup, when you watch international competition, it's not like these players are getting paid anything significant. It's almost just like expenses to play for their national teams. Their day job is with their clubs, and yet they do it, and it's so meaningful. And we're starting to see that in other sports, the World Baseball Classic, or NHL players for whom it meant so much to be in that Olympic in a competition. So I think for Messi, his legacy in World Cups is going to be as more significant representing Argentina than anything all the amazing stuff he accomplished at Barcelona and now in Miami.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, the pride for your country, the U.S. with the Olympics and hockey, those NHL players that, basically, like you said, played for expenses. And then just watching the emotions pour out of the Venezuelans when they won the World Baseball Classic, you could tell how much it meant to them.
Right.
So you're right. The playing for your country really is a big thing.
Yeah. And, it's something that, again, because we had sort of our space apart historically when it came to sport, we didn't get to experience that as much in the sports that we cared most about as Americans. I remember like the Cold War, the days of the Cold War Olympics, we would all get very invested in Olympic sports because we were going up against, the Soviets and during the Cold War. But we didn't really get to experience that as much in American football or baseball. That's starting to change. I remember the Dream Team phenomenon, 92.
Right.
Americans got to taste what other countries regularly get to taste around World Cups, right? It was like our biggest professional stars who are normally rivals. And I remember, at the time, people were like, is this going to work? Can Michael Jordan really play with Magic Johnson and Larry Bird on the same team? How is this going to work, right? Were less accustomed to that because prior Olympics, of course, our basketball team were college kids because that was the first Olympics where the insistence on amateurism had been abandoned in the basketball space. So it was this huge novelty. But as you point out, we're seeing it more and more in all sorts of other sport. And when you inject, we're all very passionate about sports, and then you inject the passion of patriotism and nationalism, and that mix is quite potent.
We've talked about all these factors about European soccer. What is it going to take for the sport to become more prominent? Is it World Cup? Is it the men's team has to do better? Is it we need more shows like Ted Lasso? Is it all of the above in order to get the sport elevated to maybe the same level or close to the same level as the NFL?
I think it's a combination of all of the above. I think the women's game in the 90s really helped advance the sport. And I don't just mean that in terms of helped grow women's soccer. It helped grow soccer in the U.S., period. Like Mia Hamm was the first household name in terms of an American player. It kind of took the foreign edge off the game. And all unintended consequences in terms of Title IX. Nobody sitting in FIFA in, Zurich in the 1980s or 70s, 80s would have thought, the way to get Americans hooked on soccer is through promoting girls and women's playing, because back then they didn't think girls or women should play. So, but it was a combination of the women's game. It was a combination of immigrants changing demographics, and then the corporate imperative. There's sort of like a top-down, those are grassroots forces, but there is a way in which, with globalization, multinational American corporations needed a sport that traveled globally.
Mm-hmm.
Coca-Cola couldn't just promote itself through America's own sports, because they wanted to be everywhere in the world. Electronic Arts is a great example, right? EA Sports, they couldn't just make Madden. As wildly successful as it was in 30% of the world, they needed a video game in sports that they could sell in Nigeria and Thailand, and so they also do FIFA, right? So these forces have been with us for a few decades now, and I'm amazed. I don't think the measure of success is whether you can catch up with the NFL. The NFL is so far and ahead, the most influential form of media, I would say, in the U.S. today. It's not just that they're the most popular sport, but so we can have a fun discussion about is the glass, given where we are today, half full or half empty. When I look at the people don't often realize, but the TV ratings for the final match of the Qatar 2022 Men's World Cup, very compelling matchup between Messi and Mbappe, Argentina against France, riveting game. That was watched in the U.S. by some 26 million people on television. That was a larger audience than the World Series or the NBA championships that same year. And there wasn't a single American on the field. Like that's remarkable, right? What are those numbers going to look like if and when the U.S. men are in a final match of a men's World Cup? When you have the sort of nationalistic, and a generation of Americans who grew up playing rec soccer, unlike not too long ago. So I think there's a long ways to go. I think maybe the next step will require the men to close the gap with the women in terms of like being a real power in the sport. But again, I wouldn't understate like how far we've come when you look at the trajectory and things like ratings for the men's World Cups or even like the Euros and in recent times, and all of the investment that media makes, not just in growing the MLS, but again in European football.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right about the women too. They've been way ahead of the men. That's why on this show, which is 22 years old, we were clamoring for a long time that the women should not only be paid as much as the men, they should be paid more than the men because they produce better results and better interest and better TV ratings. Every metric you could look at, they were out producing the men. So it's pretty simple that they should be paid at least equal to what the men were being paid. Just a few minutes left before I let you go. As you were writing this book, I always like to ask this question of people who write books. What was the most shocking, fascinating thing that you discovered in your research or your travels? You mentioned you went to Brazil. What was the most surprising thing that you came across that you didn't expect?
I think the thing that impressed me the most, and I sort of vaguely knew it, but just to witness it in a visceral fashion, was the extent to which, and you mentioned Brazil, and it happened in Brazil. It happened on trips to, recent trips I've taken to Germany and elsewhere in Europe. The passion that people in those communities feel for American sport is really impressive. It's the flip side, because I've lived in the U.S. since I was 15, and I've long been one of these people who, complain or moan or sometimes celebrate in terms of whether or not we're connecting to this world sport, right? And there's a way in which sometimes you can feel a little bit as an outsider if you're getting up early in the morning to watch a game elsewhere and you're connected to this other culture. Mm-hmm. But what was kind of, very almost moving, I would say, is to see the way in which this happens in the inverse, like the way in which there are lots of people in England who love the NFL above all else, and in Brazil, or you go to Japan. I mean, we all are familiar with the Ohtani phenomenon. Sure. And it's like it's all about people finding their people, right? And expressing their identity by affiliating with a community. It might be like when I was in reporting on all of these trends in Kansas City, stumbling across an Arsenal bar in downtown Casey in the Power Light District. But there's a way in which, there are people who are crazy about Green Bay in Sao Paulo, Brazil, And it meant everything to them that the NFL came to them, right? And these are people who feel an affinity for American culture, and it's expressed through our sport. So I think sometimes, as much as I'm a sports fan, as much as I write about this stuff, as much as I can theorize about the soft power of sport, just to see it and to see it elsewhere in the world in
Yeah.
terms of people wanting to sort of opt into American culture through sport, in a way that other generations might have, they would listen to American music, maybe even in some societies where that was like prohibited, right? And it was almost like an expression of my identity and who I want to be. Some people follow the NBA and the NFL and Major League Baseball all over the world in a similar way. And that really struck me.
All right, last question before I let you go. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this. So you teach journalism at Arizona State. I mentioned that you're formerly with the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times. I think people are really interested in where is journalism going? I mean, we see what just happened at the Washington Post. We've seen reductions at the LA Times. From where you sit, someone who worked in journalism and now teaches journalism, where do you think this is going?
Uh, I, yeah, we have a very large, successful journalism program at the Cronkite School at ASU, and I often get asked, like, well, what are all these kids going to do when they graduate, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's an exciting time of transition, and it's true that a lot of the old former models are crumbling. My first newspaper job was in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette,
Yeah.
and they are not just shrinking; they are going to call it lights out this
Yeah.
summer.
So sad.
A paper that's been around for more than a century. It is very sad. And yet at the same time, you start seeing all sorts of new, different types of media, and our graduates get amazing jobs. And for the most part, they get them. They get jobs right after they graduate. The percentage of our graduates who are going to work for a local TV station or a metropolitan newspaper might be very different than it was 20, 30 years ago. But a lot of them are getting very exciting jobs in places that didn't used to practice anything that looks like journalism. And what I mean by that is, I have a friend who is a former colleague at the LA Times who now does amazing storytelling projects within NASA. She used to be a science editor.
Hmm.
She has a whole newsroom within NASA that produces amazing content.
Right.
And there's a different generation where if you worked at NASA and you did media relations, it was probably like one or two people who were begging media outlets to cover them. And now,
Right.
and the same would be true about a human rights organization. The same is true about sports leagues and clubs, right? Where there are so many jobs for editors, people who do play-by-play, who want to cover sports, even within the clubs. But even within media, next week we're having a guest speaker come to class who has this out of Minnesota, Elliott Smith with the Arsenal Vision podcast. He's built this incredible community around this Arsenal podcast, and I want to find out how that happened for him with him sitting in Minnesota, right?
Sure.
So, but it is definitely, we're seeing the balkanization of audiences, right? And that's a very kind of familiar topic. I'm not the first. That very few places are still able to aggregate, the all-in general interest audience the way that your Metro newspaper used to be able to do, or Walter Cronkite, our school's namesake, because there were just fewer options. So there's a lot of upside and excitement and promise. The idea that I can opt into, speaking of finding your people in your communities, different media and curate it myself. There's also a cost to that, that I think we're all familiar with in terms of not having these shared narratives. So it was not great when we could only choose between 3 evening newscasts on the 3 broadcasters.
Right.
But there was also something to be said for all of us kind of watching the same movie, so to speak, and at least having a shared understanding of what was happening factually, as opposed to the options getting so diffuse that you and I could watch different newscasts that might tell us a very different story, even about what today's weather was, right? We're kind of getting to that extreme. So, I mean, that that's a big topic, and but I tend to be optimistic. We're seeing a lot of really interesting experimentation in terms of the big challenge is how do you replace what's being lost in the coverage of local news? If you're a sports fan, I don't think you feel like this is a time of crisis in terms of accessing great content about the sport, the club, the league you care about. You know, you have more choice than ever before. If you want to know what your city council is up to, that's the piece of the formerly aggregated, journalistic puzzle that needs to be figured out. And there's a lot of including nonprofit experimentation. If you look at all of the things that used to be crammed into your daily newspaper, and you start taking the things out, like your coverage of your movies or the old stock charts you used to see in the business section, international news, commentary, you could argue that all of those various pieces and elements are being done better elsewhere and that you're better off, even though I'm kind of a romantic when it comes to newspapers and I might miss it. But the one piece of that box that everything was crammed into, that bundle that sort of was orphaned and arguably is not being done better by anyone who's replaced them, is the local news coverage.
Such great points. Andrés Martinez, The Great Game, A Tale of Two Footballs and America's Quest to Conquer Global Sport in bookstores everywhere starting April 2nd. I enjoyed this conversation. Best of luck with the book. Best of luck with your teaching at ASU. And it's been a pleasure having you on Sports Business Radio.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.